Catelyn Stark was a critical part of Game of Thrones' first 3 seasons, and she was originally supposed to be played by a different actor, but I just can't imagine it in hindsight. In fact, it's hard to envision any version of Game of Thrones other than the one we got. However, HBO's fantasy series initially looked quite different. The show's original, unaired pilot episode saw a different star playing Daenerys Targaryen before Emilia Clarke. It also contained a number of details that were later changed, like the costumes and hair, as well as the White Walkers talking, via /film. Tamsin Merchant's Daenerys wasn't the only role from the original pilot that was recast, either. Catelyn Stark was originally played by someone else as well, Jennifer Ehle. Known for portraying Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, Ehle would have been a great Catelyn if given the opportunity. She matches the description of the character in George R.R. Martin's books, and her acting history indicates that she could have nailed the performance. However, it's hard to imagine Ehle in the role now, as Michelle Fairley was so iconic as Catelyn Stark. Why Game of Thrones recast Catelyn Stark from the original pilot? Jennifer Ehle stepped away from the series for personal reasons. Jennifer Ehle smiling in Pride and Prejudice. While Daenerys Targaryen's original actor was recast because Game of Thrones creators didn't feel she was the right fit for the character, this wasn't the case for Ehle, via CBR. Ehle made the decision to step away from the series for more personal reasons, despite being a fan of the Song of Ice and Fire books. Chief among these was the fact that Ehle had just become a mother and wanted to focus on her infant daughter. That's why she gave up the role of Catelyn Stark, clearing the way for Michelle Fairley to take on the part. Michelle Fairley ended up being a perfect Catelyn Stark. She captured the character's complexity impressively. Although Fairley wasn't the first pick for Catelyn Stark in Game of Thrones, she ended up being perfect for the role. While Fairley may not match Catelyn's book description as well as Ehle, she captured the character's personality masterfully throughout the show's first 3 seasons. She managed to make Catelyn likable and sympathetic, allowing viewers to become emotionally invested in the Stark matriarch, but she also nailed the more complicated qualities of her book counterpart. In the Song of Ice and Fire books, Catelyn is portrayed as a complex and sometimes harsh person. She holds Ned's alleged affair against Jon Snow, rather than being a mother to the child, and she can be cold and bitter at times. Of course, this just makes Martin's iteration of Catelyn more realistic, and it doesn't mean she has no redeeming qualities. Fairley brought both sides of the character to life well, conveying the nuance of her book moments and even nailing invented scenes, like when she opens up about not being able to love Jon. Fairley shines during the Red Wedding, too, allowing Game of Thrones' most devastating episode to land emotionally, just as it does in the books, perhaps even more so. While Richard Madden's Robb also does an excellent job of driving home the tragedy of this iconic scene, Fairley's final scream highlights why no one else could play Catelyn. At her core, she's a mother who's willing to do anything for her family, and though she's flawed at times, she's relatable and realistic. I wish Michelle Fairley had returned after Catelyn Stark's death. Game of Thrones cutting Lady Stoneheart was disappointing. Michelle Fairley as Catelyn Stark holding Fry's wife and screaming at the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones. Given how great Fairley was in Game of Thrones, it's a shame she never returned to the series after Catelyn Stark's death. In Martin's books, Catelyn's body is dumped in the river after the Red Wedding. She comes back as the undead Lady Stoneheart, a vengeful being who's bent on killing the Stark's enemies. The Lady Stoneheart storyline is a fun one, but the HBO show chose to cut this subplot. It would have been great to see how Fairley fared in such a twisted and different role, but it just wasn't in the cards for Game of Thrones fans.